Hello everyone, I'm Jim Rambo, Technical Trainer with the GSA. Now we're going to talk about how to search for content and metadata inside of Lotus Notes servers. And there's some things we need to know about Lotus Notes servers and how they work, and how to get the data out, how to get the content out of those servers. We're going to identify the requirements for the connector, and then we'll show you how to install and configure it. To begin with, Lotus Notes and its corresponding Domino server were built back in the 80s. They were one of the first client server technologies, so they have a slightly different architecture to them. In our architectural diagram here, there's something called the Domino Server, and all Lotus Notes applications get deployed into the Domino Server as a database. And as a database, they can have workflows around them, not just they can have the table structures and the workflows around them. What we want to do is crawl those databases and fetch the documents out of them and their metadata. To do this, we'll also install the connector and a portion of it into the Domino server as a database application on its own. Reason for doing this is because we can use a Domino crawler that was built by IBM. It's tested by them, and we know it works, and so that will be used to fetch the content and send it to the connector. Now, the connector will be installed as an off-board connector sitting on another server besides the GSA, and it will have its connector manager and an instance of a connector in it, and it will feed the data to the GSA and will handle auth-in and auth-z requests if you decide to use connector for authorization. To deploy the connector on that server, we're going to run the Windows installer. It will deploy the connector manager, and it will also install something called the database template for the connector. The database template is like a configuration or a schema for creating an instance of a database, and we will run the local Lotus Notes client to install that template into the Domino server and create the connector database. Features of the connector include that it supports any Domino platform and can crawl any Lotus Notes applications. Sometimes you'll hear me using the word application and database synonymously. It will selectively crawl for the records, the fields, and the versions of the documents, so we can configure that inside of the connector. It's very robust, it's very flexible in this sense. With Lotus Notes, we could have one of three configuration scenarios for authentication. First, we could have an LDAP server outside of the Domino server. So going back to this diagram, we could have an LDAP server sitting outside the Domino, and users could be getting authenticated directly by the GSA to that LDAP server. That would be one scenario. Another, and in this case, most likely what's happening is the Domino server was configured so that it performs external authentication with LDAP. Now, the second scenario would be that the LDAP server is integrated and synchronized with something called the Notes directory inside of Domino. If this is the case, then we could use the connector for authentication with the Notes directory, or we could configure the GSA to still authenticate with the LDAP server. The third scenario is where there's only a Notes directory and all the users' IDs and passwords are maintained in here. There's no notion of an LDAP server outside of it. And in that case, we definitely would set up the connector to perform authentication and authorization directly with the Domino directory. All levels of security, including database, document level, and roles-based security, are honored by the connector. We'll monitor for content and ACL changes, so if any of the content changes or the ACLs themselves change, then we will reset that record in the index. The requirements are that we support Domino 6.5 and later, that a Lotus Notes administration privileges will be needed for installing the connector. So you'll talk to your Domino administrator and say, hey, I'm going to install this connector. Either you can give me permission to do that, or I'll have to walk you through it. You also need to know Lotus Notes formula language, have experience with that for defining templates. Now, when we go to crawl and feed the database data and the metadata from within Lotus Notes applications, we use templates to define the structure of those databases so that we don't have to define them one by one. We could have a whole class of databases around documentation, and we could use a template for documentation type databases. And we'll do the configuration on the template for the fields and the metadata we want and the records we want to select, but we won't set it up on the databases individually one by one because that would take too much time. A lot of times you'll find that there are hundreds of instances of databases inside of Lotus Notes. So how do we deploy it? Well, here are the steps. We're going to prepare the Domino servers. There's a couple of changes we need to make. Then we'll install the connector manager on that external server. This will deploy the connector manager and create the database template for the connector. Then we will create and configure the connector database. So we'll use that template, we'll log into a Lotus Notes client, and we'll install the connector database into Domino. We'll define the user directory, the Domino servers, and the databases to crawl in that step. And then we will create and configure the connector, and this is where we will go back into admin console and install the connector. So preparing the Domino servers, we want to increase the execution time for Lotus Notes script on the Domino servers because there's going to be some long-running scripts. We add this line to the JVM lib security so logs can be written. And then we configure SSL to match the GSA and the Domino server. So if SSL encryption is used on your Domino server connections, then you'll also have to set up the GSA for SSL encryption. Then you restart your Domino servers. Then we'll install the connector manager. This is run by the installer. It can be installed on a Windows or Linux box. We will define the location of the local Lotus Notes directory. Coming back here to when we install the connector here, we'll identify the Lotus Notes data directory so that the template file can be stored there. We will connect to a JRE6 executable, and the connector only includes JRE5, so you might have to download a 6 version. We'll specify a service name for a Windows service. The connector manager starts as an Apache Tomcat application, runs as a Windows service in the background. And then we'll give the connector manager name that will be added into the GSA, and we can install our connector into it. We may need to, the connector template file will have to be signed so that it has permission to run in the Domino server. And here's a screenshot that shows how to create and configure the connector database. Here's where you'll specify where you're going to install the connector database. It's into the Domino server. And where do you get the template file from? Well, it's stored locally. The last thing we want to look at is the connector configuration page inside of the admin console. Here you'll specify the user password that's going to run the local Lotus Notes client API to make calls into the database. So you have to know that password of that user. We'll have the location of the connector database that we installed and which Notes server we installed it into. And then we also have to provide the admin console user ID and password if we're going to use ACLs, so they can be injected using the ACL API. Let's take a look at how to set this up. On a user workstation, I'm going to run the installer. I'm going to assume that I've already updated the Domino server. In the connector, we walk through the basics, the initial screens. We're going to install one instance of the connector, and it'll be a Lotus Notes connector. Here we specify the directories on this server for our Lotus Notes local client. Most likely it's going to be in the Lotus Notes directory under Program Files, and the data directory will be under that directory. Here we'll specify the Windows service name for the Tomcat Apache application, the connector manager, and we specify the IP address of our GSA. Need a JRE version 6, so I'll have to choose one that I've already installed. And now I'm going to choose the folder where I'm going to install the connector, and the shortcut, I'm just going to choose the defaults. Last thing I need to do is provide the admin credentials to put my connector manager in the GSA's admin console. And this is the name I'll give it. Now the service should be running on this workstation, and I should be able to see it under the shortcuts. Here's the Google connectors, Lotus 1, the name I gave it. I can install it, I can test its connectivity, I can start and stop it. In this connector we will be starting and stopping the instance. I go to admin console. Here I'll have entered the follow and crawl pattern for Google connector because it's going to send a content-based feed, and that's the URL pattern we need for a content feed. Under connector manager, I'll see Lotus 2 has been placed in here. Before I add the connector, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign the database template and set up the connector database in Domino. When it comes time to sign the database and install the connector database in Domino, I have to use Lotus Notes clients. The Lotus Notes API will have conflicts if I'm running the connector at the same time that I run these clients. So I'm going to have to stop my connector. And now I can start Domino admin. You will need admin privileges. I will go to the file system on the local machine, select templates only, locate the GSA connector template, and sign it. This will give it permissions to execute scripts inside of the Domino server. Then I'll open the Lotus Notes client, and I will use that template to install the connector database into Domino. So I will create a new database. Here's where I specify its location in the Domino server. It's going to be under my database, my Domino server called Mars. I'm going to call it Notes Connector 2. And I'm going to specify a specific folder. You'll do this too in the lab exercises. This is so we can have many students install many connectors in the Domino server without conflicts. Choose My Student Directory 2. Notice that this will be the full name for the path to the connector, and that's what we're going to use when we define the connector in admin console. I'm going to get the template from the local directory. What happens is the configuration wizard opens for the connector database and allows me to do some additional configuration on it. Under Domino servers, this is where I add, we call them regions. They're a way of specifying groups of servers by domain. And in my case, the domain is learngsa.com. Make sure you prefix it with a dot. And it's going to be in the Mars server. I'm going to save and exit. You can also specify MIME types, but we're going to skip that step in this case. Once I'm done, I'll say save and exit one more time, and this brings me to not just the system setup, but also where I can define the databases and the templates that I want to crawl. And then I'll see various messages for whether documents are being placed on the crawl queue, whether they've been submitted, whether they've been indexed, logging messages for my security authn and authz checks. Now at this point I need to close down this tab and reopen it because there's just an update on that page I need. And this will also show you how to open this database if you want to come back in and reconfigure the connector. This time I'll go to the server because that's where it's deployed now. Now I have the ability to add databases. I didn't have these buttons before. So I'll select server because we can only crawl and index content on the server. I'll choose under the help directory Lotus Notes 7 documentation. These are all public documents. Remember, I'm not going to add databases one at a time. That would take too much time, so I'll use a template to define the structure of the database. Since this is a notes help type of database, I'll use the Lotus Notes help template. You could also develop your own custom templates. An example would be for email. There's about 60 fields in an email document inside of Lotus Notes. So maybe there's only 3 or 4 fields we want, and we use a template to select them. Since these documents are all public, we're going to choose security as none. And I'll save the configuration. And when I'm done, I'll exit. Here's the database that's been added. So these, you would see maybe a list of databases you're going to crawl. Here's where your list of templates are available. These are the standard templates. If you want to add one, you can, and then customize it. Now I'm done, so I'm going to configuring the connector database inside of Domino. So I'm going to exit. We'll restart our connector manager. And now I can configure the connector inside of the GSA. Let's just refresh the page to make sure that the connector manager has been restarted. If I see red light here, that means that the connector is not running. I'll add a new connector, give it a name. This is the name that I'll see in the crawl diagnostics and in my feeds page. I'll give a password for the Lotus Notes API on the connector manager's server. That's back on this server. And it's important to note that the current user ID that's configured for Lotus Notes connections on this server is the last user that you logged in with in a Lotus Notes client. And we just logged in as student 2, and that user ID gets stored in something called the notes.ini file. If someone else were to log in, like maybe student 3 or student 4 here, then this password either needs to be changed in the admin console or needs to be we need to change the user that was last logged in the notes.ini file. Most likely that's not going to happen, but I just thought I'd mention it. Now I'll give the name of the database that the connector was installed in Domino. So it was installed in the student2 directory, and it was given the name notescon2. And which Domino server was, or Notes server was it installed in? Mars. And the username and password of GSA admin for sending ACLs if we need to. Save the changes. The connector should give green light status, and then I'll check my feeds page to make sure that the feed is pushing properly, and I'll check my crawl diagnostics to make sure that the content is in the index. On the feeds page, I can see that my connector has started crawling the content, pushing the documents along with their metadata into the index. When finished, I'll see completed status. One of the pushes is still in progress. I'm going to go to crawl diagnostics and check to see if the documents are showing up in the index. They should show up under my connector instance name that I gave it, Lotus Notes Connector. Here's what the documents look like. Each doc ID has its URL on the Mars server as part of the doc ID. This is the URL that will appear in search results. In my case, the Mars server does not have a DNS entry in my DNS server, but I have one for Domino 1, which is the host that it's stored on. Normally you'd have this DNS entry. In my case, I'll have to take this link and I'll have to change the Domino 1 name to show you what the actual search result looks like. Search result could open up into a web-enabled document if the Domino server is web-enabled, or it could point to a Lotus Notes client that would then open and run and show the document. On the search page, I run a search for some content in the Mars server. I get the search results. If I show this link, let's just copy the link address. In my case, that Mars isn't going to work. I'll just substitute Domino 1. And here I get a login page. That's the login page on the Domino server. This login name will be either the full name or the short name, depending on how your Domino server is set up. And here's the document. In this case, the documentation database was web enabled on the Domino server, so we can get results inside the browser. So some more points to touch up on. Here's how you set up the database configuration and the templates that you want to identify with them, and also the category assignments for using parametric search. Didn't go into that, but you can check the documentation for details. When it comes time to defining your templates, you'll specify which records to index, which fields to include, and how to generate search result text description tags. You can also modify the XSLT style sheet that is used to crawl the content, and this is useful because then you can add additional metadata if you want to. The default metadata here is listed, and the XSLT configuration is on the system setup page for the connector. Remember, you want to allow some time for configuring the databases and the templates that you need to use to crawl the content. If you want to use the connector for authentication and authorization, you can. You go to Serving, Auth and Mechanisms, scroll over to the Connectors tab. You'll find the instance of your connector, and you can add it and specify that you'll be using it for authentication. If users run secure searches, then they will enter in the short name for their user ID. This is what's configured by default in the connector, and you can also specify a different field. To see how to do this, check the documentation for details. So we've covered how to identify the requirements for your connector and then showed you how to set up and configure it. Remember, you're going to do some additional configuration of your Domino servers. You will run the Connector Manager installer on a separate workstation. This will create your template file for creating the connector database. Then you'll use the Lotus Notes client to install the connector database into the Domino server. And you'll go into the configuration page for the connector database, identify the servers, databases you want to crawl and index. Then you come back into Administration Console and you add a connector instance to the Connector Manager, specify the Domino servers where this connector database resides, and then you can also set up authentication and authorization with the connector. For further details, consult our documentation with the Lotus Notes connector.